Are the pharmaceutical companies really interested in the health of our children when they're making these vaccines, and the one that they're planning on making allegedly for the cure of the coronavirus? Or are they really making the problem that they'll make billions of dollars of trying to fix over the next decades, like they've done for the past decades? Robert Kennedy Jr. is a truth seeker, he's a fact finder, and he shares this information because he loves the American people. He is the president of the Children's Health Defense, and this is really a message for children today, and I welcome Robert Kennedy Jr. to the show.
Thank you, Hunter.
Thank you.
Prior to 1986, when you and I were kids, we had 3 vaccines. Kids today get 72 vaccines if they want to go to school. In many states, they cannot go to school unless they got all 72 doses. The big change happened in 1989. And the reason it happened is because Congress passed this law in 1986. The vaccine companies told Congress, vaccines are unavoidably unsafe. That's the quote. They cannot be made safe. We do not know how to make them safe. And we're going to stop making them altogether if you do not give us blanket immunity from liability. Congress gave that to them. Now they have no incentive to make vaccines safe. But there was a gold rush because suddenly those companies said, and you know this, that here we have a product where there's no liability, no matter how negligent we are, no matter how sloppy our line protocols, no matter how toxic our ingredients, no matter how grievous the injury to that child, we cannot be sued. You cannot sue them. There are no depositions, there's no discovery, there's no mass tort, no medical malpractice, there's no recourse. Those companies have zero downside to making a dangerous vaccine. And it's going to save them a lot of money because you and I know that the biggest cost for every medical product is the downstream cost of litigation because every medical product injures somebody. And that is the biggest cost. So these companies suddenly said, holy cow, now nobody was making money on vaccines before. Now we can make a ton of money. There's no recourse. Not only that, vaccines are the only medical product that never have to be safety tested. And the reason people are astounded by that, people don't believe it. Doctors do not believe it. They'll tell you that that's not true. It is true, and here's the reason why. It is an artifact of CDC's legacy as the Public Health Services, which was a quasi-military agency. The Public Health Service was the predecessor agency to CDC, and it was part of it was military. That's why people at CDC have military ranks, like Surgeon General.
Right.
And the vaccine program was
the public needs to know, you're talking about the Center for Disease Control.
Right.
Go ahead.
And the vaccine program was initially launched as a national defense against biological attacks against our country. So Congress or the CDC, the Public Health Services, wanted to make sure that if the Russians attacked us with anthrax or some other biological agent, we could quickly fabricate and deploy a vaccine to 200 million Americans with no regulatory impediments. And they said, but if we call it a medicine, we're going to have to safety test it because medicines have to be safety tested. That means double-blind placebo tests. And it means you watch them now for 5 years because a lot of injuries from medication have long diagnostic horizons and long incubation periods. So you can't just give them the medicine and 30 days later approve it as safe. So, and the main thing is you need a placebo. You need a group that is similarly situated who is not exposed to compare to the exposed group and look at the medical outcomes, the health outcomes after a year or two. And they said, we don't want to do that because we're going to have to get this vaccine out very quickly. So if we call it a medicine, we're going to have to safety test it. let's call it something else. We'll call it a biologic, and we will make biologics exempt from safety testing, and that's what they did. So of the 72 vaccines that are now mandated for American children, not a single one has ever been tested against a placebo. And that means nobody can tell you what the risk profile is for any of those products, and nobody, your doctor, CDC, nobody else can tell you if that vaccine is averting more harms and more deaths than it's causing. And I can go with you, Hunter, and I can go through each of those 72 vaccines, and I can show you with science, peer-reviewed science, at each, and their own manufacturer's inserts, their own clinical studies, that virtually every one of those vaccines is actually causing more harm than good. So these companies got together in '86 and they said, look, we have a product. You don't have to safety test it. That's going to save us $250 million. There's no downstream liability, and there's no marketing costs and no advertising costs because it's going to be mandated for 76 million children. So this is the perfect product. And they made a gold rush on CDC, and they added all these new vaccines. And a lot of the vaccines, everybody thinks that all the vaccines are for contagious diseases, that if they didn't have them, we'd all be in terrible trouble. Most of the vaccines, or many of them, are for diseases that no longer exist. For polio, for example, there hasn't been a wild polio case in this country since 1979. We still all get the vaccine. Or for diseases that are not casually contagious. And let me give you an example. The hepatitis B vaccine was developed by Merck and CDC to treat 3 categories of people: promiscuous male homosexuals, prostitutes, sex workers, and intravenous drug users who shared needles. Those were the people who got hepatitis B. But when Merck developed the vaccine, none of those cohorts, none of those categories of people wanted to buy it. And they went back to CDC and they said, you encouraged us to make this vaccine, and we put a lot of money into it, and nobody's buying it. You need to rescue us. CDC said, no problem, we'll order it for babies, and we'll make everybody take it. Now, there are certain babies who are at risk from hepatitis B, and those are babies only whose mother has the infection. But every mother, when they go into an American hospital to have a child, is tested for hepatitis B, so we know who those babies are. And you can inoculate them. But all the other children have zero risk of getting hepatitis B.
So you're actually putting the virus in them when you're putting a
Well,
vaccine?
you're putting other bad stuff because that vaccine is loaded. It used to be loaded with mercury. Now it's loaded with aluminum. And we're starting to see children. We know it's associated with Alzheimer's and many, many other injuries. And we're starting to see children who are getting Alzheimer's at 10 years old. And the hepatitis B shot only lasts for 2 years. So you have to give it to that baby and then give it to him 2 years later. And there's no chance that that baby is going to have sex with a prostitute, do IV drug use, or be a promiscuous male homosexual in that 2-year period. But they give them 5 of those vaccines before they reach the age of 10. Now, here's the problem, a real problem, is that in 1989, when these injuries started appearing, when the vaccine schedule was passed, they started adding all these new vaccines to the schedule. We started seeing an explosion of chronic diseases in this country. And those are 3 categories, Hunter, of chronic disease. Neurodevelopmental, which is ADD, ADHD, speech delay, tics, Tourette syndrome, narcolepsy. There's also an explosion of SIDS, which was unknown before the vaccines. ASD and autism. And as you pointed out, autism went from 1 in 10,000 in my generation, 1 in 2,500 in 1986, to 1 in every 22 boys today, 1 in every 34, and it's probably much more common than that. Ireland just did a study, and their vaccine schedule is less aggressive than ours. It shows 1 out of every 16 boys have autism. And Congress said to EPA, tell us what year the autism epidemic started. And EPA came back and said 1989, it's a red line. But that's not the only disease that started that year. All those neurodevelopmental disorders exploded. So you and I didn't know kids who had Tourette syndrome or narcolepsy. It was very rare to see kids who had ADD, ADHD, maybe 1 in a class, 2, not half the class like today. You know, there's schools where 80% of the kids are now on Adderall. And the allergic diseases, peanut allergies, 1989, a red line. Other food allergies, eczema, which is an allergic disease, anaphylaxis, and asthma. Now, I'm on the board, and I was the founder of the biggest food allergy advocacy group in the world because my kids all have food allergies. So it's called the Food Allergy Initiative. We've raised hundreds of millions of dollars to study food allergies. The scientists who work with us study how to treat food allergies. They're not trying to figure out what causes them. They're trying to figure out how to treat them. And the way they do that is they give food allergies to rats, and then they try to treat them. How do they give a food allergy to a rat? They use the same aluminum adjuvant that is in the hepatitis B vaccine, and they put in a protein, like a peanut protein. If you do that, that rat will have a peanut allergy for life. If you put in a casein protein, it will have a casein allergy. If you put in a meat protein, it will have a meat allergy, and so on. Latex, a latex allergy. If when you give a child an aluminum vaccine and there happens to be a Timothy weed outbreak at that moment, that child is likely to have a lifetime allergy to Timothy weed. And that's why vaccinated children have 30 times the rate of allergic rhinitis as unvaccinated children. And the studies that show that are Cowling et al. And Mawson et al. So we know how it happens. And the last category is autoimmune disease, which is now ubiquitous. It is a horrible, terrible epidemic among the vaccine generation, meaning those born after 1989. Juvenile diabetes, I didn't know anybody with diabetes when I was a kid. Rheumatoid arthritis, and so on. Now and Guillain-Barré and demyelinating diseases, all these diseases that are now ubiquitous. And there's about 420 diseases that have become epidemic since 1989. And those diseases appear on 2 lists. 1, a list of diseases that have become epidemic since '89, and 2, the manufacturer's inserts for the vaccines. There's 420 diseases listed, including all of those. The reason they list those is because under the Vaccine Act, the only way that you can sue a vaccine company is if they know of a side effect of the vaccine and they fail to list it.
And then the Justice Department defends them. Am I right?
The Justice Department defends them, and there's so many conflicts involved. Yes. But also, people will say to you, well, they just put all those diseases on the manufacturer's insert because people call up and say, I got it. They don't really have any science. That's not true. Under the Code of Federal Regulations, FDA is not allowed to allow any of those companies to put a disease on their manufacturer's insert unless FDA believes that disease is caused by the vaccine. So we're seeing this explosion now. According to HHS, prior to 1986, children born prior to 1986, the rate of chronic disease is 12.8%. If you go back 20 years, it's 6%. That is how our population is supposed to look, with only 6% having chronic disease. And today, the rate of chronic disease is 54%. And, listen, that doesn't mean that it's all coming from vaccines, because as you know, our children are now swimming around in a soup of toxics, and you've spent your career, suing people who put those into the environment, but it's in our air, it's in our water. They're in, the glyphosate and the Roundup cases, which you and I fought, and they're ubiquitous. And all of those things are contributing to this epidemic of chronic disease in our children, all of those exposures, but vaccines are the worst.
Let me follow up a little bit with some thoughts, and then I want you to respond. You use the word placebo, and before a chemical is assessed by the International Association of Research on Council and National Toxicological Profile or any other agency they do, or even the EPA or the FDA, they're supposed to do a risk assessment when they're going to assess the carcinogenicity of a chemical, for instance. You use the word placebo for the vaccine manufacturers, how they can do that assessment and they can compare two groups to one another. I would call the word placebo a control group in an epidemiology study. Is that a fair description? So we know from epidemiologists that there's two types of studies that they do. They do the case control and the cohort studies, but they base it upon, they take an exposed population and they compare that to an unexposed population.
With pharmaceuticals, what they do is they give if they're testing Vioxx or Viagra, whatever, they give the blue pill to 10,000 people, and then they give another blue pill, but it's inert. It's salt or sugar to another 10,000. Right. Those are similarly situated people. They're chosen randomly, and they're double-blind, meaning neither the subjects of the study or the researchers know who got what, so there's no opportunity for bias, and that's how drugs are approved. And then you look for 5 years, and you look for health outcomes.
And the reason I'm raising this right now, Robert, is because I've been listening to the news, I've been watching this coronavirus pandemic, which is, in my opinion, there is something happening to the public, but the numbers are greatly inflated, particularly because of, I think the CDC is in error. I've listened to the executive branch of the government's two spokespersons, Dr. Birx and Dr. Anthony Fauci, and I gravely question Dr. Fauci specifically, mainly because I've now looked at Judy Mikovitz's book. I've been reading about it. I've looked at other. And you and I have a saying in our profession, when we're trying to find the truth, whether what's true and what's not true is you follow the money. You follow the money, and it sounds to me when the money got so bold in 1986 with this legislation to be passed, then safety was thrown out the window. It was all about making the money, and they exposed our earlier generations to you and I to some hellacious vaccines. And I even read the comment about how there was a particular scientist in the CDC that had looked at evidence from 2001 to 2004 and found that there was a relationship between the mumps, the measles, and the rubella vaccine to autism. And they quashed that information. They wouldn't release it to the public. And here we are in 2020, and there was supposed to be a congressional investigation in 2014, and it still hasn't happened. So,
and that scientist, Dr. William Thompson, is still at the CDC. Yeah. Let me just give you one thought, and then I'm going to answer that question. Yeah. And this is kind of going back to what I was talking about before. Today, when I was a kid, the vaccine companies, there's 4 of them, Sanofi, Merck, Glaxo, and Pfizer, which used to be Wyeth. And those companies were making, the industry was worth about $187 million when I was a kid. And today, that industry is worth $60 billion. So they're making $60 billion selling mandated vaccines to our children, but they're making $500 billion a year selling the treatments for the injuries that are caused by those vaccines. So the Adderall, the Ritalin, the Concerta, the albuterol inhalers, the $600 EpiPens, which I have to buy for my kids, the anti-seizure medication, the Prozac, the antidepressants, and all of these, the arthritis and diabetes medications. So if you look at the top 20 blockbuster drugs for those four companies, virtually all of them are targeting diseases that are listed as side effects on their own vaccine inserts. So this is the perfect business model for them. Yeah. If they give the kid injury and then they sell them lifetime treatments. If your child gets measles, what's the treatment? The treatment is a week at home, chicken soup, and vitamin A. None of that can be patented. Nobody's making money on it. But if you can give that kid epilepsy with an MMR vaccine, you now have a lifetime client. And so that is the perfect business model for those companies. They know they're doing it. We now have figured out how to sue them. And we're suing them on the Roby case, which is a Gardasil case. We're starting with one vaccine. You cannot sue these companies for product liability. The Supreme Court has said that's off the table now. You can, though, sue them for fraud. And we're testing that theory now, and we're in court in California. We've passed a motion to dismiss. We are in discovery. We are in Merck's file cabinet for the first time in years. And, we can prove, even with the evidence we have right now, I'm confident that I could get I could get an enormous judgment from a jury. What they did, what these companies did knowingly, injuring all these kids, makes what Monsanto did with its product Roundup look like a Sunday school class. And you know this, Hunter, that these companies, the four companies that make, you have a lot of my party, the Democratic Party, who are passing mandates in all the states right now saying, you have to take these vaccines. And I go to them and I say, they're not tested. There's zero liability, and they're mandated. How can we, we signed treaties after World War II saying you can't force any human being to endure an unwanted medical intervention or to take a drug without informed consent. How are we justifying this? And in fact, the treaties say that, the United Nations Charter, the Syracuse Principle, which we invented, all say even if the life of the nation is at stake, you cannot force somebody to do that, and yet we're doing it.
And what did one of our founding fathers say, Benjamin Franklin, about being forced to do this?
He talked about fear. That anybody who thinks that they can trade a little bit of safety for their civil rights, constitutional rights, will end up losing both, and they deserve neither.
That's correct.
And we're in the middle of the COVID epidemic, but and I'll talk about that. I believe COVID is real, that people are being injured, that it is a momentous threat, that it's killing. The CDC now says 0.3%. But the question is really, and Fauci's involvement, there's been a lot of fudging of the numbers, which polarizes people, which makes people mistrustful. But the epidemic is real, the pandemic is real. The question is, how do we deal with that? And what I would argue, I was in favor of the initial idea, which is we would quarantine briefly to dampen the curve to prevent a surge that would overwhelm our hospitals and healthcare system until they could gear up, get the hospital beds, get the ventilators, get the therapeutic drugs, get the testing kits, the masks, all the things that they needed to prepare. And then you protect isolated populations, you isolate vulnerable populations, like the fragile elderly, people with chronic diseases, and you say to them, you don't have to go to work. We're going to pay you to stay at home so that people aren't injured by this. And it's a relatively trivial amount compared to the amounts we're talking about now, but that's what we would do. Isolate them, let the disease pass through the robust, hardy population, where it has an indiscernible effect on mortalities. And then once you get herd immunity, a certain number of those people, most of those people will never get the disease. A certain number of them will. And then you have protection. Sometimes the disease then will just die out. Sometimes it will return, but you have a medical system that's ready to handle it. The question is, does the quarantine kill more people than coronavirus? And that is the question that has never been answered. That risk assessment has never been done. What you're hearing from a lot of the media is, well, we need to follow the science. And I agree with that more than anybody. But that doesn't mean following Tony Fauci. Tony Fauci is a virologist. He may be able to model the number of corona deaths given various scenarios. He's utterly incompetent to model the mortalities that are imposed by economic injury. In other words, unemployment.
Does he have a conflict of interest to even be speaking to the subject?
He has lots of conflicts, and we can go into that, but let me make this point, is that if you have, there are studies from the 80s. During the 1980s, a lot of people were interested on the impacts of unemployment on American populations, because a lot of the big companies were downsizing at that time, as you remember. There were a lot of studies, a lot of resources were put into studies to find out what would happen. And the kind of the leading study of that era that is quoted everywhere shows that a single unemployment point, every additional unemployment point, kills 37,000 Americans. And this was when our population was much smaller, so it'd be much larger than that today. What that means is that, and they die from a number of reasons. About 9,000 of them die from heart attacks, 900 from suicide, and so on. In addition to that, there are 4,000 extra people who go to prison for every 1 point in unemployment, and 3,300 who go to mental hospitals. And so if you multiply that, now we're looking at maybe adding 30 unemployment points. In February, it was 3.2 unemployment and going down. And they're saying it may go up to 35. Well, what that would mean is 1.1 million people dead from unemployment. And the highest numbers, the highest projections for coronavirus deaths is about 200,000. So this is 5 times more killed by the quarantine than would be killed by the disease. And that is a underestimate, very conservative, because you're going to get people killed from other outcomes of the quarantine. For example, the disruption to food chains, to supply chains for food, for medicine. Isolation itself kills people, and there's lots and lots of studies that show that. But most convincingly, the Italian studies show that 96% of the people who died of coronavirus in Italy did not die in hospitals. They died at home or nursing homes, and they died from lack of access to medical care or isolation, that they couldn't, that they slipped, they fell. They didn't have anybody to care for them because people were avoiding them, and that's what killed them. A study that came out by the British government last week shows that there were 30,000 excess deaths in April and May in nursing homes, what they call elderly homes, in the British Isles. But of those 30,000, only 10,000 were from COVID. All the other ones were negative. 20,000 excess deaths, and they died from isolation. They died from not being able to get medicines, not being able to get health care that would have saved their lives. That means double the number have died from the quarantine that died, and there's a Canadian study that shows the same thing. The British Imperial College and Johns Hopkins just came out with a study that shows that there's going to be an excess of 6.3 million worldwide tuberculosis cases and 1.5 million deaths because of the quarantine. If you have only a 3-month quarantine, it's going to kill all those people. And Hunter, you've lived through a lot of recessions and, our state's being in severe debt. And you can see what happens when, we're driving up trillions of dollars of debt that these states are going to have to pay off. How are they going to do that? They're going to get rid of social programs for generations, the daycare programs, the school lunches, the sports, the art, all of the things that make middle-class life wonderful in our country and allow people to survive, the healthcare programs. There's already 16,000 Americans have lost healthcare. All of the programs that came out of the New Deal that created the middle class in this country are being dismantled today. And they're not going to be, because of the injury to our country from this debt, that hangover from that is going to last for generations. And, we're changing this country in a very dramatic way. Billionaires are getting dramatically richer. The middle class is being obliterated by this quarantine, not by the coronavirus, by the quarantine. And in the long run, you're probably going to have 10 or 20 times the number of people who get killed by the quarantine than would be killed by the coronavirus. So I'm not saying the coronavirus isn't serious. I'm saying nobody is giving us a risk assessment. Tony Fauci cannot assess the risk from the economic downturn and from the quarantine. He has no competency to do that. And that's what we deserve as the American people, and we ought to be able to debate these things. We shouldn't be censored. We shouldn't be silenced. People ought to be able to go on CNN and say, yes, but, yes, there is a virus. Yes, it is killing people. Are we going to kill more people because of the quarantine?
Well, you just made a great case for what I believe, that the elitists want to drive this country into full socialism, want to eliminate the middle class. And your party, the Democratic Party, historically was all about the working man and the middle class. And I mean, you're a legacy to a great father and a great uncle who had the voice of the working people. And now we see this extremism that's trying to drive us into socialism and trying to take that away from us and take these First Amendment rights. This censorship is crazy. This contact tracing, I mean, we've got a legislature in the state of Louisiana here, which is a conservative state, that are biting into that foolishness. And so those of us that speak out, we're speaking out. And I know you're speaking out. And I pray that they'll listen to you. Because, I mean, we've been given these inalienable God-given rights that are being snatched right from out under us. And they're using this coronavirus like you. I agree, it's real. But the cure, this quarantine, is much worse than what caused the situation. And I don't think it's just a risk assessment. What you've just analyzed and what you just laid out took just some reading. I mean, all they have to do is simply read the statistics. Look at the depression. Look at what evidence exists in these studies. Because when I think of a risk assessment, I think of a lot of work that has to be done, maybe studies that have to be done.
But I'm not talking about the risk assessment using
I know, but they just have to do their homework.
There's 30 million kids in this country who are not getting food.
Right.
And that we are at an unprecedented level now. We've never been at before, where there are so many kids who are starving in America. And, that is going to be the legacy of this. The injury to our children is going to be one of the legacies of this quarantine that's much worse than the coronavirus.